For years, the world looked at Jon Jones and saw a level of talent that almost didn't seem human, a fighter whose creativity, reach, timing, and sheer fight IQ made even seasoned champions look ordinary. He became the youngest UFC champion in history at just 23 years old, dominated the light heavyweight division with a calm ruthlessness, and built a legacy so overwhelming that analysts called him the GOAT long before his prime was over. But behind the brilliance, behind the highlight reel dominance in arenas from Las Vegas to Houston, there was a shadow growing, one made of scandals, suspensions, failed tests, late-night chaos, and unpredictable behavior that pushed the UFC into a corner it never wanted to admit existed. What do you do when the most gifted fighter on your roster also becomes the most volatile? How do you discipline a man whose name sells hundreds of thousands of PPV buys every time he steps onto a scale? And at what point does protecting a superstar become the organization's biggest liability? The story of Jon Jones is not just the rise of a prodigy. It is the unraveling of a myth from the inside, a slow collision between unmatched greatness and a lifestyle spinning out of control. And as each scandal mounted, from DUIs to testing controversies to the infamous hit and run, one truth became harder to hide. The UFC wasn't just managing Jon Jones, it was surviving him. To understand the chaos the UFC tried to control, we have to go back to the beginning, to the rise that no one could stop until the darkness finally caught up. The rise of Jon Jones unfolded with such speed and such clarity of dominance that it felt less like the emergence of a young contender and more like the arrival of a force of nature the UFC itself wasn't prepared for. Born in Rochester, New York, raised in a family of elite athletes, Jones carried an intensity that separated him even from his talented brothers. But nothing in his early years suggested he would rewrite the landscape of mixed martial arts. When he entered the UFC in 2008, still raw, still learning, he carried a style that was too unpredictable to emulate and too advanced for opponents to decode. Long spinning elbows, unorthodox kicks, a reach of 84.5 inches, the longest in the division, and a tactical mind capable of adjusting mid-fight made him look like he was operating a generation ahead of everyone else. By 2011, at just 23, he defeated Mauricio Shogun Rua to become the youngest champion in UFC history. And from that moment, the sport shifted. Every challenger from Lyoto Machida to Rashad Evans to Daniel Cormier fell under the same pattern: brilliance, control, and an almost effortless dismantling of world-class athletes who were expected to test him, but instead found themselves outmatched in every category. Commentators called him unstoppable. Analysts compared him to the greats of boxing and wrestling. Fans believed they were witnessing the evolution of the sport right in front of them. But with every victory, with every dominant performance, the expectations grew heavier, and the world around him changed. Fame arrived fast, money arrived faster, and the sense of invincibility that wrapped itself around Jones didn't just elevate him, it consumed him. Away from the bright lights of Las Vegas, in the quieter streets of Albuquerque, New Mexico, where he trained and lived, a different Jon Jones began to appear. Confident to the point of recklessness, indulging in nightlife, surrounded by a circle of influence that celebrated his success but never questioned his impulses. The UFC, thrilled to have a generational talent anchoring one of its most important divisions, pushed him to the forefront of every promotion, every press tour, every PPV narrative. Jones wasn't just winning. He was becoming the identity of the sport. But behind the unstoppable rise was a truth no one wanted to acknowledge. Power without boundaries rarely stays contained. Jon Jones had reached heights no one before him ever had, but he was also stepping closer to the edge of a lifestyle that the UFC could hype on posters, but could never hope to control once the cameras stopped rolling. And soon, the first cracks in the myth would become impossible to ignore. The first crack in the myth of Jon Jones didn't come from a loss inside the octagon. It came from the quiet streets of Albuquerque, New Mexico, far from the roar of arenas and the bright lights that crowned him as the future of the sport. In 2012, Jones was arrested for a DUI after crashing his Bentley into a pole, an incident that shocked fans not because a young celebrity made a reckless mistake, but because it was the first time the world saw that the fighter who looked untouchable in the cage could be dangerously vulnerable outside it. It was a warning sign, one the UFC hoped would fade quickly, but instead, it was only the beginning of a pattern that would grow darker, louder, and harder to hide. In 2015, the scandal that redefined his image struck with a force no opponent ever had: the infamous hit-and-run incident. Jones was accused of running a red light in Albuquerque, colliding with another vehicle and fleeing the scene. The other driver, a pregnant woman, suffered injuries, and when police searched Jones's abandoned rental car, they found documents linking it to him, along with what reports described as drug paraphernalia. The story exploded across every major outlet in the country, not as a headline about a world champion, but as a warning about a superstar spiraling out of control. The UFC responded swiftly, stripping Jones of his light heavyweight title and suspending him indefinitely. Publicly, it looks like a decisive moral stance, but privately, the organization faced a crisis it didn't know how to contain. Jones wasn't just another fighter, he was the backbone of an entire division, a guaranteed PPV draw the athlete networks wanted to promote and fans expected to see. Losing him didn't just hurt rankings, it threatened revenue projections, broadcast commitments, and the carefully scripted narrative the UFC had built around its most gifted athlete. And yet, even as the world condemned him, the UFC left subtle doors open. Statements that hinted at a future return, messages that kept the idea of redemption alive. They didn't erase the scandal, but they softened it, reframed it, controlled the angles in ways that made it clear the story wasn't over. The hit and run was supposed to break him. Instead, it revealed something more complicated. The UFC was willing to impose punishment, but not sever ties. They needed him too much, but Jones's troubles didn't stop there. What followed the hit and run were nightclub incidents, altercations, police reports, and moments of chaos that filled tabloids and sports news cycles with dizzying frequency. Each time, fans wondered if this was the scandal that would finally push the UFC to let him go. Each time, the UFC expressed disappointment, promised internal discussions, and announced disciplinary action that always stopped just short of permanent separation, because the truth was becoming impossible to hide. Every scandal deepened the tension between Jon Jones, the athlete, and Jon Jones, the reality. He was brilliant, he was reckless, he was irreplaceable, and the more the UFC tried to keep his talent front and center, the more evident it became that they were losing control of the man behind it. The hit and run should have been the end of his reign, but instead it was the beginning of a new chapter, one in which the UFC wasn't just managing a champion, but trying desperately to manage a crisis that only grew larger with every decision he made. If the hit and run exposed Jon Jones's personal chaos, the testing controversies that followed threatened something even more fragile: the legitimacy of his greatness. Beginning in 2016, Jones's name became entangled with USADA in ways no champion of his stature ever had, pulling the UFC into a storm of scrutiny that questioned not only Jones's integrity, but the organization's willingness to bend when the stakes were high. It started with what was called a potential anti-doping violation, just days before his headlining fight at UFC 200 against Daniel Cormier, a bout that was supposed to cement his legacy. Instead, the event imploded. Jones was pulled from the card, leaving the UFC scrambling to salvage a milestone event it had promoted for months. The substance detected, clomiphene and letrozole metabolites, sparked immediate debate across the fight world, with some analysts calling it a career killer and others insisting the results were accidental. Jones denied wrongdoing, but the damage was done, and USADA handed him a suspension that once again removed the UFC's biggest star from the spotlight at the worst possible moment. When he finally returned in 2017, defeated Cormier with a head kick, and reclaimed his position at the top, the celebration lasted only days. The victory was overturned to a no contest after another banned substance, Turinabol, appeared in his system. To many fans, it looked like confirmation. To others, it looked like a tragedy. To the UFC, it was an emergency. But what happened next turned the controversy into something far more complicated. Independent experts hired by USADA determined that the metabolite detected in Jones's system was consistent with what they called a pulsing effect, meaning that tiny trace amounts of a long-term banned substance could appear intermittently without indicating new ingestion. It was scientifically plausible, but emotionally explosive. Critics accused the UFC of protecting its biggest star. Fighters across divisions questioned why Jones received explanations and flexibility no one else got. Fans argued on both sides, and the UFC was thrust into a position where every decision looked like a defense of Jon Jones, even when the science was solid. The tension reached its peak in December 2018, when the UFC made one of the most controversial moves in its history, relocating UFC 232 from Las Vegas to Los Angeles on just 6 days' notice, because the Nevada Athletic Commission declined to license Jones due to the lingering pulsing findings. It was a moment so unprecedented that it sent shockwaves across the combat sports world. Tens of thousands of fans had their travel scrambled. Fighters complained of financial losses. Analysts questioned whether any star, no matter how great, should influence an entire event to this degree. Yet the UFC insisted the science justified the decision, that Jones was not cheating, and that the organization was simply following the data. And while that might have been true, the optics were devastating. For many, it confirmed the growing belief that the UFC wasn't just promoting Jon Jones, it was shielding him. Every test failure, every overturned fight, every suspension followed the same pattern: chaos, confusion, explanation, reinstatement. It created a shadow over Jones's accomplishments and a cloud over the UFC's disciplinary system, raising a question the organization never fully answered. Was Jon Jones too valuable to punish like everyone else? Behind the scenes, executives were dealing with more than controversy. They were dealing with the terrifying reality that the most talented fighter in the sport's history might also be the most damaging to its credibility. And the deeper the testing scandals went, the harder it became to maintain the illusion that the UFC still had control. The octagon could contain his skills, but nothing seemed capable of containing the chaos that followed him outside of it. As the testing controversies continued to cast a shadow over Jon Jones, the chaos outside the octagon began to swell into something even more destructive, revealing a private world spiraling far beyond anything the UFC's carefully crafted narratives could control. In Albuquerque, New Mexico, where Jones lived and trained, the nightlife became a recurring backdrop for incidents that blurred the line between scandal and disaster. Bars and clubs buzzed with stories of sightings, arguments, confrontations, and moments where alcohol, fame, and impulse collided in ways that made headlines before the night was even over. The arrest in 2012 for DUI had been a warning, but what followed over the years became a pattern. A series of escalating reports that painted the image of a champion losing his grip on discipline and drifting deeper into a life where consequences felt optional. The breaking point arrived in 2020, when police responded to reports of gunshots in Albuquerque. Jones was found intoxicated behind the wheel, a firearm in the vehicle, and an open bottle of alcohol beside him. The footage from the arrest, released publicly, was jarring. This wasn't the invincible fighter fans saw in the cage. It was a man struggling with demons that no training camp or championship belt could suppress. But perhaps the most heartbreaking moment came in 2021, in Las Vegas, just hours after Jones was inducted into the UFC Hall of Fame for his legendary fight with Alexander Gustafsson. Police arrested him again following what was reported as a domestic disturbance. Jones was alleged to have struck his fiancée, an allegation he denied, but the arrest report described behavior so erratic and volatile that even longtime supporters were stunned. As always, the UFC expressed disappointment, but stopped short of issuing the kind of punishment that would normally follow such a public crisis. They seemed trapped between their responsibility to uphold discipline and their fear of losing the fighter, who carried so much of their brand's history, revenue, and identity. Behind closed doors, executives debated his future, coaches urged him to seek stability, and teammates watched as the man who once trained with precision and purpose drifted into long absences filled with uncertainty. The turmoil seeped into Jones's career, disrupting training camps, delaying returns, and creating long stretches of inactivity that frustrated fans who wanted to see him fight and frustrated the UFC, which no longer knew what version of Jon Jones would show up next. The brilliance inside the octagon remained undeniable. His technique, his timing, his ability to adapt were still unmatched. But the chaos outside it was growing louder, darker, and more unpredictable, forcing the UFC into a defensive posture each time another headline dropped. They were no longer just managing a superstar. They were managing the fallout of a life collapsing under the weight of fame, expectation, and unrestrained freedom. And as Jones battled legal issues, substance-related incidents, and emotional instability, a more pressing truth emerged. The fighter who once looked unbreakable had become the embodiment of volatility. A man whose genius was being overshadowed by a public unraveling the UFC couldn't stop and couldn't walk away from. Because despite the scandals, despite the arrests, despite the chaos, they knew something the public was only beginning to understand. Jon Jones wasn't just another champion. He was the most valuable and the most dangerous asset they had ever built. And the deeper his personal life descended into turmoil, the more impossible it became to answer the question every fan kept asking. How long could the UFC keep holding everything together before something finally broke that no one could repair? As the chaos surrounding Jon Jones intensified, one truth became clearer than anything the UFC ever admitted publicly. He was simply too valuable to lose. While scandals mounted, divisions shifted, and champions rose and fell, Jones remained the backbone of the UFC's long-term financial ecosystem, a singular force whose presence on a fight card guaranteed massive attention, higher viewership, and pay-per-view numbers that few fighters in history could replicate. Executives privately acknowledged that replacing him was impossible, not just because of his unmatched skill set, but because no other athlete carried the same draw, the same aura, the same ability to turn a routine event into a global spectacle. When Jones was active, millions of dollars moved. When he was absent, the UFC felt the loss immediately. But the organization wasn't just dealing with a superstar. They were dealing with a problem that required delicate management. Every time Jones faced legal issues, the UFC framed it as a temporary setback. Every testing controversy was explained with scientific detail. And every scandal that could have destroyed a lesser fighter was absorbed into a carefully controlled narrative that promised redemption, framed accountability as growth, and positioned his eventual return as inevitable. Because for all the damage Jon Jones caused, the UFC feared something far more dangerous: what the sport would look like without him. When Jones announced his plan to move to heavyweight, a division rich with new challengers and new promotional opportunities, the UFC seized it as a lifeline. A fresh storyline, a reinvention, a chance to extend the career of their most polarizing star at a moment when younger fighters could no longer hold the spotlight in the same way. And when he finally returned in 2023, defeating Cyril Gane in the first round to become the UFC heavyweight champion, the message was unmistakable. Even after years of chaos, court cases, suspensions, and public meltdowns, Jon Jones was still the most important fighter the UFC had. But that victory also deepened the organization's dilemma. The more Jones won, the more leverage he had. His contracts became larger. His negotiations became harder. His demands shifted from financial incentives to control, influence, and creative power. He criticized the UFC publicly, questioned fighter pay, challenged Dana White, and pushed the boundaries of what the promotion could tolerate. Yet no matter how tense things became, the UFC always left the door open. Because they knew that losing Jones meant losing one of the last megastars capable of carrying the sport through uncertain eras. Younger fighters had talent, but not global recognition. Champions emerged, but none commanded headlines like Jones. The UFC was trapped in a loop of dependence. Every scandal made Jones harder to manage, yet every victory made him more indispensable. And beneath everything lay one haunting question constantly whispered across the industry. Did the UFC protect Jon Jones because they believed in him, or because they feared what would happen if he walked away? In the end, the answer didn't matter. What mattered was the reality that Jon Jones had become bigger than the system built to contain him. The UFC could punish him, suspend him, relocate entire events for him, and rebuild divisions around him, but they could never replace him. He was too talented, too profitable, too unpredictable, and too deeply intertwined with the sport's identity to ever be treated like anyone else on the roster. And as the years passed, the organization realized that the chaos they tried to control had grown into something more powerful than any champion or executive could manage. A force created by the UFC, empowered by fame, and driven by a fighter who refused to play by the rules because he no longer had to. In the end, the story of Jon Jones is not just the story of a prodigy who kept falling, or a champion who couldn't escape the chaos outside the cage. It is the story of a fighter who became so essential to the UFC that the organization found itself reshaping rules, rebuilding narratives, and absorbing scandal after scandal simply to keep him in the picture. Jones's brilliance, the same brilliance that carried him to titles in 2 divisions and secured his reputation as the GOAT, was also the foundation of the UFC's greatest dilemma. How do you enforce discipline on the one fighter you cannot afford to lose? His life became a cycle of dominance and disaster, victory and volatility, a pattern that revealed something deeper than any headline ever captured. Jon Jones wasn't just fighting opponents. He was fighting himself, the expectations placed upon him, and the consequences of a life lived without breaks. And every time the UFC tried to steer the narrative, the truth remained just beneath the surface. That no matter how many suspensions, controversies, or legal battles surfaced, the organization always left the door open for his return, because the sport without Jones felt smaller, quieter, and less alive. So the final question lingers, the one the UFC has never publicly answered, and the fight world still whispers today. Did they control Jon Jones, or did his chaos control them? What comes next? Redemption, decline, or something even more unpredictable remains unwritten. But one thing is certain, Jon Jones changed the UFC forever, and the echoes of his rise and unraveling will shape the sport long after he is gone.